Please subscribe to the channel to watch the latest videos.
White House scrambles to repair relations with Arab, Muslim Americans. Biden's comment that he has no confidence in civilian death toll provided by Palestinians incensed some community leaders. One ripple effect of the Israel-Gaza war is the warp-speed unraveling of relations between President Biden and some of his most loyal voters, Muslims and Arab Americans. This week at the White House encapsulated the strains, beginning with a listening session for frustrated administration personnel from those communities and ending with a controversial meeting between the president and 5 Muslim figures picked by the White House who had faced enormous pressure from activists to decline and protest. The open disdain toward Biden from many in a reliably Democratic bloc is among the many signs the conflict is quickly remaking U.S. domestic politics, with public fury over a Hamas attack that killed 1,400 Israelis colliding with the horror of entire families in the Gaza Strip being wiped out in Israel's retaliatory strikes. The events of the week were described in detail in interviews with several Arab American and Muslim advocates inside and outside the administration, nearly all of them speaking on the condition of anonymity to candidly describe their dealings with the White House. One organizer said community concerns could be boiled down to a critical question: are we dealing with warmongers or are we dealing with peacemakers? Who are we dealing with? For many Muslims and Arab Americans, the answer came Wednesday when Biden cast doubt on the number of Palestinian casualties because the figures come from health officials who report to Hamas, which controls the territory. Historically, such figures have been accurate, according to Middle East researchers. On Thursday, Hamas released names, national ID numbers, and other information for the 6,747 people included in the Gaza Health Ministry's tally. The group said 281 bodies had not yet been identified, bringing the total to 7,028. Biden's remarks, which the administration later reiterated in formal statements, were interpreted by many as calling Palestinians liars, or as equating Gaza's beleaguered medical professionals with Hamas. A senior Arab American White House staffer who is directly involved in engagement with the concerned communities said high-level staffers are holding several meetings with Arab, Muslim and Palestinian Americans to discuss the White House response. The staffer described Biden and other top officials' approach as one of humility and humanity and characterized the conflict as dynamic and complex. The staffer declined to comment about what has been said in the meetings. When asked whether anything would change in Biden's tone or policy as a result of the meeting, the person pointed to the October 20 news conference in which the president reiterated U.S. support for Palestinian self-determination. "We mourn every innocent life lost. We can't ignore the humanity of innocent Palestinians who only want to live in peace and have an opportunity," Biden said then. In a statement Friday, White House spokesperson Robin Patterson cited those comments and said the administration is reaching out to hear directly from members of Muslim, Arab American, and Palestinian American communities. "We'll continue to engage in conversations with these important communities and to be unequivocal in condemning hate and discrimination against them." Incensed U.S. Arab and Muslim advocacy groups this week called Biden's remarks about the death count dangerous, and some prominent voices from those communities chimed in on social media, saying that the president had lost them and that they were considering sitting out the 2024 election. When word got out that the president wanted to meet with community leaders, ones approved by senior staffers, national activists immediately began working the phones to pressure invitees to decline or to accept only on the condition that Biden answer for his remarks about Palestinian deaths. "Why are you sitting down with him without any agreement that he's going to retract that statement and apologize?" one community organizer involved in talks said. "What seat at the table are you negotiating, the toilet seat?" The meeting ultimately took place Thursday, capping a week of fraught discussions that left Biden's relations with many Arab Americans and Muslims deeply wounded. Rifts among the national advocacy groups emerged as they struggled to build a unified response to the conflict. Above all, Arab Americans and Muslims interviewed by the Washington Post expressed a sense of isolation, of feeling adrift in a party they had viewed as a haven from the open hostility toward them expressed by Republicans and their de facto leader, Donald Trump. "You can't reduce this to a political calculation that, by 2024, these communities won't remember this," and I am talking about communities, plural, Arab American, Palestinian American, young voters. I'm talking about people who spent their lives working on peace in the region, said Maya Berry, a longtime civil rights activist and executive director of the Arab American Institute. These are all voters who won't forget. Damage control. The administration's week of damage control meetings with U.S. Arabs and Muslims began Monday at the State Department, where a small group of community representatives sat down with Secretary of State Antony Blinken. The conversation was intense but remained cordial, one participant said. The visitors had strategized beforehand to keep the conversation focused on legal questions related to U.S. support for what the United Nations and other rights monitors have called Israel's collective punishment of Gaza's 2 million residents, about half of them children. Are we following the international rules or not? Are we wavering away from that? What policies are decisions being based off of? The participants said, summarizing the questions. The response, the person said, was that those were important questions but that everything's been happening so fast they've been focused on trying to keep it from spreading and turning into even more of a deadly conflict. There were no breakthroughs, the participants said, but the meeting had helped those there understand that the administration's reluctance to talk about a ceasefire came from an insistence that the situation not go back to the status quo of Hamas rule in Gaza. The Arab Americans and Muslims at the meeting agreed on that point. None of us want to return to the status quo, except bad actors who are profiting off of it, the participant said. And we said Hamas is not the only bad actor profiting off this, and we left it at that. Talks were more emotional later that evening at a separate temperature-taking meeting in which senior White House officials tried to reassure Muslim and Arab American political appointees from across government. The event was billed as a listening session with senior administration officials, and those who showed up didn't hold back, according to 3 people with direct knowledge of the meeting. Dozens of people were in attendance, one participant estimated around 70, from across the government, including intelligence agencies, the State Department, the Department of Homeland Security and the Department of Health and Human Services. Participants, some in tears, spoke about their endangered family members in the Middle East, of feeling isolated and under suspicion in their government jobs, and of feeling complicit in the administration's support for Israel's siege. They feel like they're being censored and they feel like they're being met with suspicion, they're not trusted in their jobs, one person with direct knowledge of the meeting said. At one point, the officials asked how many people in the room knew someone from Gaza. Nearly everyone raised their hands. Next came a more uncomfortable question: how many of those in the room had been pressured by friends or relatives to resign from the administration in recent days? Again, most hands shot up. The officials in the room included White House Chief of Staff Jeff Zients, Senior Advisor Anita Dunn, the White House Liaison to Muslim Communities, Mazen Basrawi, and representatives from the State Department and other agencies. Second Gentleman Doug Emhoff, the husband of Vice President Harris, also briefly stopped by. The official's response, as summed up by an attendee, was, "We hear you. We're with you. It's hard. It's challenging." The Arab American White House staffer involved in the community engagement efforts said the multiple meetings with critics inside and outside the government signaled that the administration was willing to hold tough conversations. The official added that they personally felt heard in the White House. The attendees hadn't expected a policy shift from the meeting, according to the accounts, but felt confident that their concerns would be conveyed to Biden, to be taken into consideration in his public remarks about Palestinians. 2 days later, the president made the comments questioning the accuracy of Palestinian casualties at a time when Arabic-language TV channels were showing non-stop footage of lifeless, dust-covered children being pulled from the rubble after Israeli strikes. Whatever we said in that room is presumably falling on deaf ears, because it's not changing the tenor or tone, much less the policy making, one person involved in the talks said. After Biden's casualty figure remarks, some administration appointees began to consider resigning, but as that same person put it, that's one news cycle. Then what? That person said that they and others had spent years working inside the Democratic machine for better representation of their communities, and that this wasn't the time for ceding ground. There is a sense of obligation to be able to voice concern and say this is an injustice unfolding before our eyes and we've got to change, the person said. A controversial White House meeting. The most controversial meeting of the week came Thursday with the White House extending an invitation to 5 national Muslim figures who were picked by the White House in a process one person involved with the talks described as a show. The guest list: Minnesota Attorney General Keith Ellison, Democrat, who made history as the first Muslim elected to Congress and who has written about his multiple trips to Gaza; Rami Nashashibi, a Chicago-based Muslim whose community organizing earned him a MacArthur Genius Grant in 2017; Imam Mohammed Majid, a Washington-area cleric and interfaith leader who often appears at political functions; Wael Al-Zayed of the Muslim lobbying group MJIJ; and Suzanne Burakat, a healthcare advocate. Other activists said that while the invitees were well-known and generally respected advocates for U.S. Muslims, the humanitarian catastrophe in Gaza makes this a time for Palestinian voices, including Christians. "I'm not upset by who is going. I'm upset by who's not going," the person involved with the talks said. "They're going to come out and check a box and say Biden met with the Arab American community, and it's not true." One of the 5 invitees, who spoke on the condition of anonymity to comment candidly about a sensitive issue involving the White House, said the decision to attend was one of the hardest dilemmas they had ever faced. A key concern, the invitee said, was that only one Palestinian American was to be present. A second Palestinian American, who had lost scores of relatives in the Gaza strikes and was publicly critical of the U.S. response, had been invited and then was disinvited, according to several advocates who were upset by what they interpreted as a snub. After much soul-searching and external pressure, the participant said the group decided it was an obligation to attend. "It's our jobs, given the position we are in, to go and speak truth to power, to the most powerful man in charge, on behalf of the children under the rubble who cannot," the invitee said. The participant said the goal was to press Biden on a ceasefire and the need for broader and more meaningful engagement with Palestinians. The person added that the group was unequivocal on the issue of Gaza casualty figures and livid. "The president seemed more focused on a debate about data than about the fact that many hundreds of children have been killed. We said, Palestinians are dying. We're not okay with the numbers of their dead being disputed." Contacted by the Post about the meeting, Ellison said in an email, Muslim community leaders told President Biden that the suffering of innocent Gazans trying to survive in extremely difficult circumstances has actually increased the likelihood of Islamophobic attacks in the United States. The president listened carefully, responded sincerely, and showed empathy and compassion for the suffering of everyone. "I am hopeful he will act on that empathy." Versions of these discussions are going on throughout the country among Muslim and Arab Americans who say they feel betrayed by and furious with the White House, feeling that Palestinian lives are being disregarded and international law and norms trampled. "It's really crazy to me that the Democratic Party destroyed 20 years' worth of goodwill with Muslims and Arabs in just 2 weeks, losing an entire generation that was raised in the Progressive Coalition, possibly forever," Iman Abdul-Hadi, a University of Chicago professor of comparative human development who studies Palestinian Americans, wrote Thursday on X, formerly Twitter. In an interview, Abdul-Hadi said community members weren't surprised Biden was supportive of Israel. "But the blank check, is scary," she said, especially given the mounting civilian casualty toll. "Young people already are talking about sitting out the election in protest," she said. At a recent campus event that drew hundreds of students, Abdul-Hadi said, she told the audience, "I think Biden has lost the Muslim vote." The entire room erupted into clapping, she recalled. This generation was raised in a time when Muslims and Arabs were constantly in contact with Democrats, felt and were part of the Progressive Coalition. Now that is completely disillusioned. Gallup polling showed that in early 2022, for the first time in more than 20 years, more Democrats said that their sympathies lie with the Palestinians than with the Israelis, 49% to 38%. Biden has made multiple comments about the need for all sides to protect civilians. At a news conference Wednesday, he said that the flow of humanitarian aid into Gaza needed to increase and that Israel needed to do everything in its power to protect innocent civilians. But some Muslim and Arab American leaders say words are no longer enough. "There's that Arab saying, don't look at what the mouth is saying, look at what the hands are doing," one person involved with the White House meeting said. "Look what the hands are doing. They are stoking the flames." How Mike Johnson went from little known to House Speaker in 24 hours. Just hours after securing the Republican nomination for House Speaker, Majority Whip Tom Emmer, Republican, Minnesota, walked into a conference meeting Tuesday evening and bluntly informed his colleagues that he knew how to count votes, and that he knew he didn't have them, before exiting the room and wading through a throng of reporters in a fit of frustration. "Emmer's done," GOP staffers in the hallway murmured to one another. He was the third Speaker nominee in less than 2 weeks to bow out of running to lead the most polemical and fractious GOP House conference in recent memory. Confused, hungry, and exhausted, lawmakers pondered their dwindling options in the muggy, windowless meeting room. How could they explain this to their constituents? Representative Marcus J. Molinaro, Republican, New York, a swing district freshman with a faded New York accent, stood up and queried the room. He laid into colleagues who had questioned Emmer hours earlier in what witnesses described as a public flogging of the Minnesotan, telling his fellow Republicans to stop the purity tests for their Speaker nominee, particularly on an issue on which there is as much national consensus as same-sex marriage. Molinaro accused Republicans who lambasted Emmer of being cruel to gay and lesbian Americans, some of whom, he suggested, worked in their offices. If they didn't let go of the quest to find a perfect nominee, he said they would never unite around a Republican speaker, according to people familiar with the debate. They also couldn't start the process over, Molinaro argued, and have to explain to their constituents that they still hadn't picked a speaker. Holding an immediate vote in conference for the person who came in second to Emmer was the only alternative, Molinaro said. Many conservatives rolled their eyes at Molinaro's speech, but it helped pull other Republicans in swing districts along, and rallied weary members to break the impasse. Less than 24 hours later, Representative Mike Johnson, Republican, Louisiana, became the newly elected Speaker of the House. The remarkable turn of events for Johnson, a relatively unknown, ultra-conservative lawmaker, was the result of a confluence of fatigue, luck, and his lack of enemies. The evangelical policy wonk's name had been swirling as a long-shot candidate for several weeks. But in the absence of other viable options, and in search of a compromise between influential leaders who had failed to clinch the speakership, but still held sway, Johnson ascended to second in line to the presidency. But the true test for the new speaker lies ahead. With little deal-making experience, he will have to steer an unruly conference away from a potential government shutdown, field impending requests to aid Israel and Ukraine, and try to grow, or at least not lose, the GOP's razor-thin majority in next year's elections. This account of Johnson's rise and the uncharted path forward for a fractious House Republican conference is based on conversations with more than 24 Republican lawmakers, aides, and consultants, most of whom spoke on the condition of anonymity to discuss private conversations. Johnson's swift ascent to Speaker-designate came about over plates of lukewarm spaghetti and meatballs. After lawmakers agreed to an expedited nomination process, Johnson first had to best 4 other men who thought they had what it took to fill the vacancy. In the first round of voting, Johnson garnered 85 votes, pushing out Representative Charles J. Chuck Fleischman, Republican, Tennessee. On the second ballot, Johnson's vote count rose to 97, eliminating Representative Roger Williams, Republican, Texas, from consideration and prompting Representative Mark Green, Republican, Tennessee, to end his bid. Johnson won the third ballot over Representative Byron Donalds, Republican, Florida, 128-29. But 44 lawmakers had held out their support for other candidates, one of whom surprisingly finished in second place. 43 of those votes went to Representative Kevin McCarthy, Republican, California, who had been ousted as Speaker 21 days earlier. Like a jilted lover, McCarthy had been unable to entirely let go of the powerful Speaker's perch. He continued to hold news conferences after he became the first Speaker ever removed by a House vote. He squatted in the Speaker's office in the weeks after losing his title, publicly bemoaned the crazy 8 Republicans who supported his ouster, and never closed the door on the efforts to draft him back into the job. Some of the 43 people who voted for McCarthy on Tuesday evening saw it as a way to poke at Matt Gaetz, the Florida Republican who led the effort to oust McCarthy, Representative Don Bacon, Arneb, said. But others suspected a more nefarious scheme to return McCarthy to power was in motion, according to lawmakers in the room. As members moved toward abbreviating the conference election process Tuesday in the interest of time, McCarthy consistently expressed objections to the suggested adjustments. After Emmer, who McCarthy backed for Speaker, dropped out, Molinaro made a motion to skip the secret balloting and move directly to a roll call vote for Johnson, who had come in second place to Emmer. "That's not how you elect a speaker," McCarthy lunged forward and yelled, according to people familiar with the deliberations. He protested again when another member asked if the conference could waive the rule requiring a candidate forum and move straight to the election. Meanwhile, a groundswell of support for McCarthy was threatening to disrupt Johnson's momentum. During the candidate forum later that night, freshman Representative John S. Duarte, Republican, California, made the case for writing in McCarthy's name and asked the 5 speaker candidates to follow suit. "I wanted to show that Kevin McCarthy is still, by many of our assessments, the legitimate Speaker of the House, and the 8 people breaking with conference to cause this chaos is not a legitimate form of running our conference," Duarte said on Friday, while adding that Johnson was going to be a great speaker. Representative Trent Kelly, Republican, Mississippi, subsequently praised McCarthy but admonished McCarthy's supporters that the former speaker need to decide whether he was running for his old job or not, according to people in the room. It only became clear that McCarthy was polling nearly every write-in vote after Representative Drew Ferguson, Republican, Georgia, a loyal ally of Majority Leader Steve Scalise, Republican, Louisiana, who was the conference's first speaker designate before dropping out, noted that the number of other votes had risen from 31 on the first ballot to 34 on the second, and demanded to know who those votes were for. The room was stunned, according to people familiar with the deliberations, when GOP Conference Chair Representative Elise Stefanik, Republican, New York, revealed that McCarthy had received all but one of the other votes. The last one went to Representative Jim Jordan, Republican, Ohio, the conference's second speaker designate, who was forced out by over 100 Republicans after he was unable to win the speakership after 3 failed House floor votes. Lawmakers looked toward McCarthy and Jordan, who were sitting near each other. The former speaker just stared down at his phone, according to a person briefed on the meeting. Green stood up and said it was clear to him that some people were playing games. Meanwhile, an unworkable and quickly panned plan was being whispered about, McCarthy and Jordan serving together in some kind of co-speaker arrangement. Some members began thinking McCarthy was behind it. "There is some swampy s going on," in the words of some Johnson backers. "Some members are talking about it," McCarthy told reporters when asked if there was any momentum to the co-speaker idea. "It was Kevin McCarthy's antics," Representative Ralph Norman, Republican, South Carolina, said of why Republicans rallied around Johnson. "He tried to prevent Mike from getting a majority." McCarthy's moment of redemption never arrived, but the late wave of enthusiasm for him provided Johnson with a clear blueprint of which factions of the party he still needed to win over. Johnson's reputation as humble and well-liked, along with his deeply conservative bona fides, made it easier to smooth over concerns about him than it was for previous speaker candidates. At one point during this process, Representative Kelly Armstrong, Republican, North Dakota, said he went through the list of all 221 House Republicans to figure out who doesn't have 4 enemies, the number of Republicans a speaker candidate could lose and still be elected through Republicans' narrow majority. Johnson and Representative Bruce Westerman, Republican, Arkansas, were the only 2 he could think of, he noted. Johnson met and talked one-on-one with House Republicans after he won the nomination. That included the 3 lawmakers, Representatives Mark Amodei, Republican, Nevada, French Hill, Republican, Arkansas, and Thomas Massie, Republican, Kentucky, who voted present during a roll call vote to gauge whether Republicans would support Johnson on the floor. They eventually were swayed into Johnson's corner. He also met with Molinaro. The New York Republican, who had voted against Jordan when it was clear he did not have the votes to become speaker, spoke with Johnson about his track record of remarks, op-eds, and bills criticizing the LGBTQ+ community just hours after Molinaro rebuked his colleagues for forcing Emmer out of the race because he voted in support of same-sex marriage. Johnson reassured Molinaro that he would no longer represent just his conservative Louisiana district, according to a person familiar with the conversation. Instead, Johnson continued, he would represent the entire Republican conference and protect vulnerable swing district incumbents like Molinaro. Molinaro went on to support Johnson on the House floor, and was chosen to escort Johnson into the chamber once he was elected, which vulnerable Republicans considered a sign that the ultra-conservative new speaker viewed them as part of the team. He also spoke with lawmakers who were absent Tuesday night, including Representative Andrew R. Garbarino, Republican, New York. Johnson assured him that the state and local income tax deduction, which Republicans eviscerated in their 2017 tax law, must be addressed in any tax bill the House considers, according to Garbarino, a top priority for him and two other New York Republicans who blocked Jordan from becoming Speaker. Garbarino endorsed Johnson ahead of the floor vote. Many Republican lawmakers remarked on how modest and easygoing Johnson is. However, one lawmaker surmised that they had never exchanged harsh words with him only because they had never engaged in substantive policy or political debate with the Louisiana lawmaker. Another Republican noted the first time they ever spoke to Johnson was when he launched his Speaker campaign over the weekend, but the conversation was cordial and very basic. It's hard to get to know somebody in one phone call, the Republican lawmaker said, who has since lambasted the rushed process to elect a speaker that prevented them from fully vetting his controversial record. Republicans say there are pros and cons to Johnson being relatively unknown. One pro, for vulnerable incumbents, is that he is not a known entity, like Jordan, to independent voters who dislike former President Donald Trump and his MAGA movement. But Johnson is also unknown as a fundraiser, having raised barely $450,000 through his leadership PAC to donate to colleagues since launching it 7 years ago. McCarthy, who is often described as having an unmatched ability to haul in millions, has telegraphed to multiple people that he will donate funds to Republican colleagues as Johnson works to get his own footing. Johnson, whom his peers predict might be the weakest speaker in recent history, also lacks close allies on Capitol Hill, unlike McCarthy and previous speakers. Republicans have yet to hear any plans for how he will bring lawmakers into the fold, but have been given assurances that decisions will be made by members, rather than the Speaker. Scalise was Johnson's mentor when he first arrived in Washington in 2017. They were never particularly close, but Scalise is closer to him than any other member of leadership. Scalise, a fellow Louisianian, is expected to step into the power vacuum McCarthy has left, given Johnson's lack of experience, and be one of the most powerful majority leaders. Moderate Republicans, who doggedly opposed Jordan for Speaker because of his track record as a combative hardliner and election denier, suddenly dropped those concerns about Johnson despite the similarities in their voting records. As they near the deadline when government funding runs out in mid-November, they made the calculation that a government shutdown would be worse for their re-elections than a conservative speaker, especially in an election year when Trump is likely to be on the top of the Republican ticket and Democrats' main focus, not Johnson. Some members, however, privately raised those fears to Johnson during their brief meetings. One vulnerable Republican asked Johnson not to put up for a vote any extreme amendments to the half-dozen appropriation bills the conference aims to pass over the next month. This member also asked to alleviate pressure on freshman members by not making them vote on any controversial abortion bills. Johnson has co-sponsored a number of anti-abortion bills, including one last year that would ban most abortions after 15 weeks. The speed of Johnson's election, which prevented spending much time poring over his record, have left some Republicans alarmed at what reporters and researchers have already unearthed. Others view his relative anonymity and lack of relationships as an opportunity. It's a great opportunity. Think about it. He's a blank canvas to everyone else, one moderate Republican said. He has the capacity to now build up his reputation, and I think he's suited to kind of build it by holding us together, not forcing us into things we don't want to do. Other moderates and governing-focused Republicans echoed that sentiment. They considered Johnson more malleable than McCarthy. Johnson, who told Republicans he met with that he has an open heart, open mind, knows he must decide how to spend his political currency and whether to use it to fulfill promises he's made to lawmakers. If he truly believes that only Republicans, as a competent majority, can move that open heart, open mind to a more free country, then he has to keep the majority by listening to us. Period. There is no other option. So he only has one opportunity that he should fully recognize, and that's making sure that he's paying attention to all the different groups that are within the Republican Party, and who we represent, one centrist Republican said. Some are holding him to his word. After Johnson met with several members of the Republican Main Street Caucus, according to one person familiar with the meeting, the lawmakers wrote down the promises Johnson made and sent them to him directly, a marked difference from when holdouts against McCarthy's speakership in January claimed he made promises that neither group wrote down. Johnson, however, will only have so much control over shaping his image. On Wednesday, after his triumphant win on the House floor, the 8 GOP members who voted to oust McCarthy took credit for replacing him with Johnson. Gaetz argued that the new speaker was just the latest sign that Trumpism was making gains in the halls of Congress. As lawmakers walked back to their offices on Thursday in the unseasonably warm October sun after Johnson's second day as speaker, some of them cheerily sung MAGA Mike's praises. "I call him MAGA Mike Johnson, he's all about Trump, Trump's all about him, so I'm very pleased that he stepped up and was able to get the support of the entire conference," said Representative Troy E. Nehls, Republican, Texas, who suggested installing Trump as speaker. "I think he could probably be speaker for a very long time. Oh, he's got a tough job though, too. We gotta pray for him. I don't know how he does it. It's an impossible job." Airlines, Biden administration to clash in case that would reshape industry. A trial is set to begin in U.S. District Court in Boston focused on JetBlue Airways' $6.8 billion bid for rival Spirit Airlines. Mergers among U.S. airlines in recent decades have left passengers with fewer air travel choices. The Justice Department is taking a step for the first time on Tuesday to stop the number of industry players from shrinking further. It's bringing its case to a judge. A trial is set to begin in U.S. District Court in Boston focused on JetBlue Airways' $6.8 billion bid for rival Spirit Airlines. It would mark the first time regulators have gone to court to stop a merger between two U.S. carriers, coming as 4 carriers dominate the domestic market. The Justice Department has challenged previous mergers, most notably in 2013 when American Airlines and U.S. Airways combined to create the world's largest carrier, but the cases were settled before a trial. JetBlue has offered concessions, but regulators argued in court filings they fall short and are moving to block a proposal to create the 5th largest domestic airline. The effort is the latest from the Biden administration to apply stricter enforcement to the nation's antitrust laws. "This is a different DOJ," said William J. McGee, a consumer advocate and senior fellow for aviation and travel at the American Economic Liberties Project. "In my lifetime in this industry, we have never seen the DOJ be so aggressive on the airline front." JetBlue's bid, which would create the first airline merger in 7 years, comes after the Justice Department has challenged proposed deals in a range of industries, including technology, healthcare, and publishing. A Justice Department lawsuit against Google, the first antitrust case filed against a tech company in more than 20 years, is underway in a federal courtroom in Washington. While the administration's results have been mixed, regulators successfully blocked a merger in the publishing industry but lost a bid to stop another between 2 healthcare companies. The strategy points to a willingness to cite more novel theories of harm to consumers and workers, said Diana Moss, Vice President and Director of Competition Policy at the Progressive Policy Institute. Ultimately, the question of whether JetBlue will merge with Spirit will fall to U.S. District Court Judge William G. Young, who is scheduled to hear arguments during a trial expected to last about 3 weeks. The Justice Department is joined in the suit by attorneys general in 6 states and the district. The trial will begin months after the Justice Department won an antitrust case in the same Boston court that also involved JetBlue. In his ruling, District Court Judge Leo T. Sorokin ordered American and JetBlue to dismantle an alliance that allowed them to coordinate schedules and share revenue on certain routes in the Northeast. The airlines argued unsuccessfully they needed to combine operations to compete with larger carriers. While making its case for the Spirit merger, JetBlue is offering arguments similar to those it made to justify its American alliance. "We look forward to presenting our case in court as we strongly believe our combination with Spirit is the best opportunity to disrupt the industry by increasing competition and choice, creating a long-overdue national low-fare challenger to the dominant Big Four airlines," JetBlue said in a statement. The Justice Department didn't respond to a request for comment about the case. According to a Justice Department filing in the Northeast Alliance case, the 4 largest airlines had 55% of the domestic air travel market in 2000, while a dozen smaller carriers competed for the rest. Today, the top 4 U.S. airlines account for 80% of the market, with the number of smaller competitors dwindling. Organic growth of the sort needed to mount a national challenge to the legacies would take decades, JetBlue argued in court filings. JetBlue's merger with Spirit would turbocharge JetBlue's growth and create a strong fifth national player in the domestic airline market. That growth will result in lower fares and higher quality, while still offering the no-frills service some travelers prefer, JetBlue's attorneys said. The Justice Department contends a merger would lead to fewer flight options, particularly for cost-conscious customers who prefer Spirit's business model of low ticket prices and extra costs for choosing a seat ahead of time or bringing a carry-on bag. In court filings, regulators noted Spirit has developed a loyal following. The proposed acquisition would eliminate Spirit, a disruptive and innovative competitor, and reduce consumer choice in hundreds of markets that it serves today or would serve in the future, the Justice Department argued in court filings, adding that JetBlue planning documents show a merger would result in fewer seats and higher prices in markets Spirit currently serves. A wave of airline mergers in the years after the September 11, 2001, attacks saw the disappearance of Northwest Airlines, Continental Airlines, and U.S. Airways. The last major domestic airline merger occurred in 2016, when Virgin America was acquired by Alaska Airlines, which outbid JetBlue. Consumer advocates say the disappearance of smaller carriers has led to an oligopoly, in which a market is dominated by a few large companies. Those concerns were amplified by airlines' pandemic-era performance, a time when they received $50 billion in government grants and loans to maintain operations but weren't prepared to handle a surge in travel demand. Those disruptions spurred calls for new consumer protections and penalties for carriers that don't meet obligations. The Transportation Department has launched several investigations during the pandemic, including into whether Southwest Airlines knowingly scheduled more flights than it could operate amid a massive breakdown in December 2022. The Biden administration also said it would propose regulations to force airlines to compensate customers for more than the cost of their ticket when flights are canceled or substantially delayed. Labor unions are split on a merger between Spirit and JetBlue, while the proposal has put consumer advocates in the unusual position of advocating for an airline they have long blasted for its business model and treatment of customers. The list of problems with Spirit is a long one, but the answer is not for it to go away, McGee said. We'd like to see Spirit become a better airline and improve. He said travelers might not realize they benefit from Spirit's presence regardless of whether they fly the airline, because it forces competitors to lower prices. John Brault, Vice President of Public Policy, Telecommunications, and Fraud at the National Consumers League, said most important is whether consumers have choices. What needs to exist is competition, he said. Say what you want about Spirit and other low-cost carriers, but they have had an impact on prices that consumers pay. Craig Minerva, a partner with Axon, Veltrop and Harkrider and a former lead attorney in the Justice Department's Antitrust Division, said while lawyers have made a strong case for why the merger shouldn't be approved, one hurdle is the carrier's size, adding that a merger of small rivals is very rarely an antitrust problem, if ever. Henry Hartevelt, an aviation analyst and president of Atmosphere Research, said despite its size, Spirit has proved to be a formidable competitor to larger rivals because it has gone head-to-head with the major players. Unlike other ultra-low-cost carriers that focus on serving smaller airports, Spirit has muscled into major terminals like Chicago's O'Hare International, Dallas-Fort Worth International, and Houston's Bush Intercontinental, forcing larger carriers to compete on prices. However, he said if the government is worried about concentration in the market, it would be better served by focusing on strategies that help smaller carriers become stronger competitors. If the government is worried about concentration in the industry, it should be more worried at the concentration at the higher levels, he said. To counter that, they need to help other airlines become larger and become more of a competitor to the big four carriers. Some Spirit customers said they worry the loss of the discount carrier could mean fewer flights. Tyler Dunbrack, 30, recently drove 3 hours to Baltimore-Washington International Marshall Airport from Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, because Spirit's $300 round-trip fare to Las Vegas was the best option he and friend Tiffany Stagg, 27, could find. It's like the Greyhound of flying, Dunbrack said. Stagg said she worries that if Spirit disappears, fewer people would be able to afford air travel. Even Elizabeth Jackson D'Ambrosi and her husband, Fred, who vowed never to fly Spirit again after it canceled their flight to San Antonio earlier this month, said competition in the industry is important. The couple ended up paying more than $1,200, nearly 3 times the cost of their original Spirit tickets, to rebook on United. "I don't want to just have a few choices," Elizabeth Jackson D'Ambrosi said. The deal between JetBlue and Spirit was finalized in July 2022. Spirit had announced plans to merge with Frontier Airlines before JetBlue swooped in with its surprise offer. Spirit initially resisted JetBlue's overtures, arguing a merger with the New York-based carrier was unlikely to win regulatory approval. But ultimately, the low-cost carrier was unable to persuade enough of its shareholders to spurn the JetBlue offer. A combination of Frontier and Spirit would have eclipsed JetBlue to become the nation's 5th largest carrier. Robin Hayes, JetBlue's chief executive, has said he expects the deal to close in early 2024. If it doesn't win approval for the merger, JetBlue would have to pay a $70 million fee to Spirit and $400 million in fees to Spirit shareholders. UAW reaches tentative agreement with Stellantis to end strike. The agreement largely matches the deal that the United Auto Workers negotiated with Ford, giving workers 25% pay raises over 4.5 years. The United Auto Workers reached a tentative agreement with Stellantis to end the union's strike against the automaker, said a person familiar with the talks, moving the industry closer to resolving a historic work stoppage that has shuttered dozens of U.S. factories and warehouses. If ratified by a majority of the automaker's UAW workers, the new contract will give Stellantis employees a 25% raise in base wages over the next 4.5 years, the person said. The deal and a similar October 25 agreement with Ford give the UAW its biggest gains in years after a hard-fought campaign by the union's combative new president, Shawn Fain. The 6-week-long strike has rattled the economy and the Biden administration, which has been pushing to resolve the work stoppage in an industry that contributes 3% of the nation's gross domestic product. The UAW strike has been the union's first against all of Detroit's big 3 automakers at the same time, as workers railed against years of their wages not keeping up with inflation. The fallout for the automakers has been swift, with General Motors this week saying the strike was costing it $200 million a week, and that was before the UAW walked out of an additional GM plant in Arlington, Texas, on Tuesday. The contract negotiations have been acrimonious, with Fain frequently lashing out against corporate greed and lucrative executive compensation. The automakers have at times accused Fain of grandstanding for the cameras instead of engaging in real negotiations, and they have warned that significantly increasing their labor costs will make it hard for them to compete against non-unionized rivals. Ford Chief Financial Officer John Lawler said Thursday the deal will raise Ford's labor costs by $850 to $900 per vehicle produced. Ford will still remain profitable, he added. Vatican Synod ends with divide over women deacons and LGBTQ+. Vatican City, days before the start of the most significant Catholic gathering since the 1960s, Pope Francis dropped a theological bomb. In a reply to conservative bishops concerned about his openness to the LGBTQ+ community, the 86-year-old Pope effectively said he could envision priests, on a case-by-case basis, blessing same-sex couples if those benedictions fell short of the sacrament of marriage. In the subsequent weeks, how and whether to welcome LGBTQ+ Catholics became, according to participants, the most contentious topic at the month-long synod that closed Saturday in Vatican City. Facing opposition from senior clerics from Eastern Europe, Africa, and elsewhere, the wording of a concluding report, with sections approved by at least a 2/3 majority of voting members, fell far short of the inclusive language used earlier by the Pope himself. The document failed to even mention the phrase LGBTQ+, as used in preliminary materials. The most it ventured to say was that people who feel marginalized or excluded from the Church, due to their marital situation, identity, and sexuality, also ask to be listened to and accompanied, and that their dignity is defended. It also lumps sexual orientation under a slew of ethical questions described as new and controversial, including artificial intelligence. "We are a family and we must respect everybody's pace," Synod General Secretary Cardinal Mario Grech told reporters who questioned the Synod's position on homosexuality and other issues late Saturday. "We must journey together." The Synod, a gathering of the Church's highest consultative body, which for the first time included lay people and women as voting members, is seen as a landmark moment in the Church. Delegates arrived after broad consultations within regions and countries on the issues facing the church. They will now recess, consult with their local churches and reconvene next October before offering what is expected to be a final set of recommendations to the Pope. Delegates described a civil, constructive atmosphere in recent weeks, but also disagreements, including on the role of women in the church and the question of priestly celibacy. But the gulf over LGBTQ+ reception suggested the extent of the ideological rifts dividing a global church of 1.3 billion Catholics, as well as a challenging road ahead for Francis as he seeks to unify the faithful and cement his legacy in the latter stage of his papacy. Going into the synod, conservative Catholics, particularly in the United States and Eastern Europe, had derided the event as a smokescreen for liberal reform, while progressives in Western Europe and elsewhere dared to hope that it could foster long-awaited changes in official teachings. But the caution indicated a high hurdle for liberals looking for rapid change. "I'm a bit disillusioned," said Rosanna Virgili, a theologian at the Rome-based Pontifical Lateran University. "It looks more like a rehash of Catholic doctrine." The synod called it urgent to ensure that women can participate in decision-making processes and take on roles of responsibility in pastoral care and ministry. But delegates were clearly split on how that should happen. There was no mention of women in the priesthood. The document did call for theological and pastoral research on women deacons to continue. But it noted opposition to even that step, saying dissenters express the fear that this request is the expression of a dangerous anthropological confusion. The 2 paragraphs on female deacons, which failed to clearly back the idea, passed the synod's 2/3 threshold with the lowest number of votes. The document also recommended that adequately trained women could be judges in canonical trials. Differences also emerged on maintaining priestly celibacy, an issue of deep importance to Catholics in remote regions where clerics are in short supply. The synod's conclusion was simply that the topic merited further consideration. The Pope has sent mixed signals on both topics. Ahead of the meeting, Francis said there was no clear and authoritative doctrine on the question, adding that it could be a subject of study. But in an interview published this year by 2 journalists, Francis, going deeper, appeared to find little rationale for ordaining women, or giving in to calls for married priests. In 2020, Francis ruled against allowing married priests in the Amazon region, which is suffering from a severe clerical shortage. Vatican synods, held in the past with only bishops and cardinals as voting members, tend to convene 2 to 3 times per decade. But the 2-year synod called by Francis is the most ambitious church summit since the Second Vatican Council of 1962 that ushered in major reforms, including the Catholic Mass being celebrated in vernacular languages, rather than just Latin. Several participants, speaking on the condition of anonymity due to Vatican requests that delegates keep the synod's inner workings private, said no issue divided the consultative body more than the question of LGBTQ+ reception. The same Pope who made headlines in 2013 by saying, "Who am I to judge?" when asked about gay priests, signaled an even wider door for the LGBTQ+ community ahead of and during the gathering. As the event approached, the Pope issued a written response to concerned conservative bishops in which he affirmed that same-sex couples could receive Catholic blessings, but not the sacrament of marriage, on a case-by-case basis as determined by local church officials. On October 17, as the synod was in full swing, Francis symbolically welcomed Sister Janine Gramick to the Vatican. An American nun, Gramick was sanctioned in 1999 by then-Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger, the future Pope Benedict XVI, for her LGBTQ+ advocacy. A week later, Francis met with a delegation from the Global Network of Rainbow Catholics, an LGBTQ+ group. Yet conservative bishops from Poland, Hungary, Nigeria, Ethiopia, Australia, and elsewhere ardently rejected same-sex blessings, calling them tantamount to condoning sin and a colonial imposition from liberal Western Europeans. In public and private comments, they described homosexuality as disgusting and unnatural. Officially, Catholic teachings state that homosexuality is intrinsically immoral and contrary to the natural law. One delegate, Archbishop Stanislaw Gadecki, president of the Polish Bishops' Conference, stood firmly by those teachings. He said in an answer to written questions from the Washington Post that he sometimes felt the non-Catholic voice was more audible than the Catholic one at the synod. He specifically called out the liberal German church, where priests are already blessing same-sex couples, for advocating reforms that draw profusely from Protestant theology and the language of modern politics. He said that for LGBTQ+ people, a truthful encounter with Christ meant a conversion, turning away from sin and adopting a lifestyle in accordance with the gospel. Benedictions, or blessings of homosexual unions, would mean that the Church approves of the lifestyle of homosexual partnerships, even if it does not equate them with marriages, which also means sex between same-sex couples, Ju.dy wrote. What has always been defined as a sin in the Judeo-Christian tradition would now become something positive. Liberal delegates sought to strongly counter those arguments. One delegate told a story of a woman who died by suicide after failing to obtain church absolution for being bisexual. Another delegate, the Reverend James Martin, an American priest who ministers to the LGBTQ+ community and was handpicked as a delegate by Francis, told a story of a longtime same-sex couple in which a man had painstakingly nursed his cancer-stricken partner before he died. He asked the synod to consider if that were not a genuine sign of love. In an interview, Martin declined to confirm details of the synod debate but said, "I'm disappointed not only that LGBTQ people were excised, but also that the discussions we had, which were passionate on both sides, were not reflected in the final document." But I'm not surprised, Martin said. There was great resistance to the topic among many members. Some fear terrible precedent despite his terrible record. The truth-averse Republican faces a vote later this week over expulsion, part of growing number of political ethics battles in the House. Let's stipulate up front that Representative George Santos, Republican, New York, has told lies that have, despite these divided times, brought an overwhelming majority of lawmakers to the conclusion he never should have served a day in Congress. Santos had to appear in court on Friday, pleading not guilty to 23 federal charges. The allegations include 10 new felony counts such as money laundering and identity theft related to his congressional races, coming after a guilty plea from Santos's campaign treasurer earlier this month for helping the embattled lawmaker commit these alleged crimes. He should absolutely resign, former Congressman Charlie Dent, Republican, Pennsylvania, said in an interview Friday. However, having served 8 years on the House Ethics Committee, including 2 as chair, Dent will say out loud what many lawmakers are afraid to say in public: Santos should not be voted out of office. At least not a few days from now, when some politically endangered Republicans from Santos's neighboring districts, tired of being tied to the embarrassing freshman, plan to force an expulsion vote to the full House. During the more than 230 years of congressional history, just 5 members have been expelled by the House, 3 for disloyalty to the Union during the Civil War and 2 in the last 45 years after they had been convicted in federal court in felony corruption cases. Santos has not been charged with treason, nor has he been convicted of a crime, not yet anyway. In addition, an ongoing Ethics Committee investigation is just that, ongoing. Members have to be concerned about the precedents they're setting, Dent said Friday. It would set quite a precedent. This expulsion vote, which requires a 2/3 majority to oust Santos, will serve as the highlight of several votes that could be filed under the broad umbrella of the privileged resolution wars. It's part of a growing effort to bypass anything resembling a legitimate investigative process. Instead, it moves straight to impaneling the entire House to serve as instant prosecutors, judges, and juries for misdeeds that would probably be better served with a somber and, yes, slow-moving investigation from the ethics panel. The Israel-Hamas war has prompted a dueling set of resolutions offered by rank-and-file members to censure members over controversial statements. First, Representative Marjorie Taylor Greene, Republican, Georgia, has offered a resolution under the privileged status that requires a vote within a couple of days to censure Representative Rashida Tlaib, Democrat, Michigan, over recent statements in support of Palestinians and for speaking out at a rally inside a congressional office building demanding a ceasefire. Tlaib, one of 10 lawmakers to oppose Wednesday's resolution condemning Hamas and voicing support for Israel, called Greene's resolution Islamophobic. In return, Representative Becca Balint, Democrat, Vermont, filed a privileged resolution that would censure Greene for years of controversial statements that many considered anti-Semitic. In the history of the House, just 25 members have been censured, almost half of them related to the Civil War or slavery and the Reconstruction period. Most censures of the post-World War II era came after lengthy investigations into bad behavior. That's what happened after then-Rep. Jerry Stutz's, Democrat, Massachusetts, relationship with the House page in the 1980s came to light, as well as the censure in 2010 of then-Rep. Charles B. Rangel, Democrat, New York, over charges that he used his position to personally benefit from an education nonprofit he created. But starting in 2021, when Democrats censured Representative Paul A. Gosar, Republican, Arizona, after he posted violent videos showing animated videos of him attacking lawmakers, the House has practically turned into a censure-on-demand palace. No investigation took place, just an instant, near-party line vote to offer the highest form of punishment short of expulsion. A dozen or two of Gosar's closest conservative allies stood in the well of the House alongside him as a show of defiance when the charges against him were read in public. Republicans returned the favor in June when they censured Representative Adam B. Schiff, Democrat, California, whom they had already voted to remove from the House Intelligence Committee, for his actions investigating then-President Trump late last decade. Nearly 100 Democrats gathered in the well with Schiff, shouting down then-Speaker Kevin McCarthy, Republican, California, as he read the charges into the record. Rather than creating a sense of shame, these instant censures just add to the sense of political celebrity in the effort to gain attention. Schiff, who is now running for the Senate, has been open about how that censure helped boost his already hefty campaign account. Not long ago, even though it sometimes feels like decades ago, misbehaving Republicans and Democrats alike used to feel political heat under the speakerships of Nancy Pelosi, Democrat, California, John A. Boehner, Republican, Ohio, and Paul D. Ryan, Republican, Wisconsin. Former Congressman Anthony Weiner, Democrat, New York, resigned in 2011 after a social media sex scandal. Former House member Chris Lee, Republican, New York, resigned earlier that year when he was caught soliciting extramarital partners online. And former lawmaker Mark Souder, Republican, Indiana, resigned in 2010 after having an affair with an aide. One-time Congressman Vito Fossella, Republican, New York, was arrested while driving drunk in the Virginia suburbs, telling police he was on his way to see his family, which turned out to be true, just not his family in Staten Island. His mistress and child lived out there. He resigned once it was all exposed. Members used to be able to feel shame, Dent lamented. Now, outlandish behavior gets attention, and party leaders have less ability to force lawmakers to resign. And the other party, driven by the instantaneous news cycle of revenge, doesn't have the patience to file an ethics complaint and wait the year or more required for an investigation. Santos's situation presents the most difficult of all. He has lost whatever credibility he might have had at the start of the year, when he was known merely as a serial fabulist, as an investigation has unearthed charges of serious criminal behavior. The federal judge set his trial for next September, meaning a verdict wouldn't be likely until later in the fall. By then, he will have almost run out the clock and served a full term in Congress, even as his chances of winning his party's nomination have shrunk to non-existent. Despite pledges from McCarthy of a speedy ethics committee probe, there's no hint of when that will end. And much of the panel's work will likely sidestep the criminal behavior under the purview of the Justice Department, to not interfere with that federal inquiry. The slow-moving pace has driven a group of New York Republicans, all in the same media market as Santos and all in politically tough districts, to the breaking point. They don't want to be associated with him anymore and want him gone, sooner rather than later. When they broached their plan to force an expulsion vote in a few days, new House Speaker Mike Johnson, Republican, Louisiana, told them privately that they should do whatever is in their best political interest. Do what's right and do what's right for back home, Johnson said, according to the account several of the Republicans gave to reporters after filing the motion on Thursday. There's a problem with that. Expulsion from Congress simply is not intended to alleviate political pain. A conservative constitutional lawyer by training, Johnson appeared to realize that later Thursday night in his first interview as Speaker, telling Fox News that Santos did deserve due process. If we're going to expel people from Congress just because they're charged with a crime or accused, that's a problem, he said. The New Yorkers feel that a guilty plea from Santos's treasurer serves as enough legal confirmation to warrant instant expulsion. You have a guilty plea in court by his treasurer, confirming significant details, Representative Michael Lawler, Republican, New York, said. You're not dealing with somebody who is a rational human being, Lawler added. Representative Anthony Desposito, Republican, New York, noted that McCarthy's ouster as Speaker, and the more than 3 weeks it took to find Johnson as his replacement, left the GOP caucus in an internal feud that left them leaderless. That helped prompt their decision to force the Santos issue, Desposito told reporters. We seem to settle a lot of family business in the House this week. This is one of those things that has gone on for too long, and it feels good that we're making progress toward the resolution. Dent understands this exasperation, both with Santos and other misdeeds that prompted the competing censure resolutions. He said it's time for cooler heads to prevail between Johnson and House Minority Leader Hakeem Jeffries, Democrat, New York, to pull back all these instant verdicts in the ethics wars. Or else. There could be a lot of censure resolutions for reckless behavior, Dent said. This won't be the last expulsion motion. Mike Pence suspends his struggling 2024 campaign. The former vice president was unable to gain traction in the face of Donald Trump's dominance in the race. Las Vegas, former Vice President Mike Pence suspended his campaign for the GOP presidential nomination Saturday, facing the reality that there was little appetite for his candidacy among the legions of Republican voters who remain loyal to his former running mate Donald Trump and viewed Pence as a traitor because he refused to follow Trump's demands to overturn the 2020 election results. After staying fiercely loyal to Trump for nearly 4 years in the White House, Pence sharply and publicly broke with Trump over his efforts to overturn the election and his inaction during the January 6, 2021 attack on the U.S. Capitol. During his announcement speech in June, Pence argued that Trump's efforts to overturn the 2020 election were disqualifying, declaring that anyone who puts themselves over the Constitution should never be President of the United States. That approach fell flat with the party base. After much prayer and deliberation, I have decided to suspend my campaign for president, he said in a speech here at a gathering of the Republican Jewish Coalition, drawing extended applause and a standing ovation from a room that has long admired his staunch defense of Israel. He said he had concluded this moment was not his time and appeared to make an implicit appeal against Trump, urging GOP voters to choose a Republican standard-bearer who, in the words of Abraham Lincoln, would appeal to the better angels of our nature, and not only lead us to victory, but lead our nation with civility back to the time-honored principles that have always made America strong and prosperous and free. Pence's years-long descent from first in line for the presidency to an also-ran reached a conclusion at a high-profile summit which brought together some of the most powerful Republican donors in one room. The gathering drew 9 presidential candidates to speak Saturday morning, including Trump, who made no mention of his former vice president even though he took the stage a short time after Pence announced that he was dropping out. The former vice president, who previously served as a governor and congressman, becomes the highest-profile Republican to leave the race, exiting at a moment when support for the non-Trump candidates has splintered, leaving Trump on a glide path to the nomination less than 3 months before the Iowa caucuses launch the primary season. The splintered field has worried many Republicans looking to stop Trump, putting pressure on other struggling candidates like Senator Tim Scott, Republican, South Carolina, to show a viable path to the nomination. Florida Governor Ron DeSantis and former UN Ambassador Nikki Haley have been battling at the top of the lower tier to secure a distant second against Trump. Pence's decision to end his campaign, which drew an audible gasp from the audience as he shared his news, underlined his desire to command a supportive audience for his parting words as he urged the United States to continue to play a leading role in the defense of both Israel and Ukraine. Advisors said he decided to make his announcement at the RJC because he wanted to underscore his view that the United States must continue to play a central role in backing Israel in its war with Hamas, which is emblematic of the message he has been driving, that the party should reject the populist and isolationist tendencies that are increasingly being embraced by the far-right flank of the Republican Party. That includes the idea that America has a critical role to play in helping democracies like Israel and Ukraine defend themselves. While Pence had not made January 6 the key focus of his campaign early on, his rare challenge of a president under whom he served in the number 2 slot, and his central role in Trump's legal entanglements, as a key witness, added another extraordinary layer to the competition. The warm reception Trump received minutes later after Pence's remarks, even as he faces legal peril, reflected the former president's dominance in the race and the challenges candidates like Pence have faced in trying to topple him. Taking the stage immediately after Pence, DeSantis made no mention of the former vice president or his decision to drop out of the race, instead issuing a statement on X, formerly known as Twitter. Haley, by contrast, opened her remarks by praising Pence, calling him a good man of faith and a good man of service who has fought for America and for Israel. The former UN ambassador also stepped up her criticisms of the former president at the same gathering, praising his record supporting Israel, rejecting the Iran deal and recognizing Jerusalem as Israel's capital. Her rival's departure from the race created an opening for Haley to further lay claim to the traditional hawkish GOP lane on foreign policy, advocating strong support for Israel and Ukraine. While largely united on Israel, much of the party, including Trump, have taken a more skeptical posture toward helping fund Ukraine's war against Russia. But as Americans, we need to ask a critical question. We all know what Trump did in the past. The question is, what will he do in the future, she said. The stakes couldn't be higher. And given those stakes, we cannot have 4 years of chaos, vendettas, and drama. Supporters of Pence's rival candidates welcomed the narrowing of the field, which they view as an essential element in the path toward dislodging Trump, who leads the field by an average of about 50 points. It's not clear that the small slice of the electorate supporting Pence would break toward any one candidate because DeSantis and Scott are both also targeting the evangelical voters that Pence was pursuing in Iowa. Haley, Trump's former ambassador to the United Nations, had, like Pence, been appealing to more hawkish GOP voters as they rebuked the isolationist tendencies that are on the rise in the GOP. Still, this is the first of the dominoes to fall, said Nicole Schlinger, a longtime Republican operative in Iowa. This is the first of the dominoes of the candidates who were on that first debate stage. Schlinger noted that Pence's struggle was evident on the ground in Iowa, where the former vice president was recently just going to places where there was already a crowd built rather than organically drawing voters to his own events. For weeks, Pence has looked increasingly vulnerable as he courted voters in a party that is still fully in the thrall of Trump. Though Pence was staking his candidacy in Iowa, where he hoped to building a winning coalition rooted in his support among evangelical voters, he struggled to rise out of the single digits in the polls and was running dangerously low on cash fewer than 100 days before the caucuses in Iowa. Pence said Saturday that he and his team had always known this would be an uphill battle, but he said he had no regrets. He did not mention Trump by name in his remarks. Cam Savage, an Indiana-based GOP consultant, said that Pence was caught in virtually impossible situation as he tried to court GOP voters, because he had both alienated the Trump wing of the party with his actions on January 6, yet was not a fresh enough alternative for those looking for change after Trump. His actions on January 6, for which I hope he is remembered as a patriot, were demonized by certain segments of the party, and that made it difficult for him to gain traction with one segment of the party, Savage said. He also was not new. For those looking to move on, he didn't really fit that bill either. Savage added that Pence's campaign trajectory underscored the fact that the Republican primary electorate does not yet seem to be interested in moving on from Trump. In focus groups and interviews with voters in early contest states, questions about Pence often yielded shrugs and expressions of disinterest, even from Republicans who admired his efforts to ensure the election results were certified on January 6, 2021, even as some Trump supporters were outside on the U.S. Capitol grounds yelling "Hang Mike Pence." By the end of September, Pence was facing mounting debt, a very limited supply of cash to spend in the primary season, and has given $150,000 of his own money to his campaign, according to recent filings with the Federal Election Commission. He was hovering around 5th place nationally in the polls, and 6th and 7th in Iowa and New Hampshire, key early states where he would have needed a strong finish to build momentum for the primary. He raised $3.3 million, the least of any current GOP candidates except Arkansas Governor Asa Hutchinson, and spent almost the same amount in the third quarter of the year. He had $1.2 million cash on hand and a debt of $620,000 at the end of the quarter. His struggle to raise money and to gain traction above single digits in the polls, which were critical metrics for making the next debate stage in Miami in November, reflected the antipathy toward the former vice president among rank-and-file GOP voters. He was frequently overshadowed by DeSantis and Haley, who have somewhat less complicated histories with Trump and stronger arguments about their path to the nomination. With the Iowa caucuses fast approaching, Pence was facing serious challenges in paying for the day-to-day activities of a campaign, including the hefty fees required for candidates to get on the ballot in states all over the country. More importantly, he faced deep skepticism among donors who could not visualize his path to the Republican nomination. Ultimately, those challenges proved too difficult to overcome. It was not immediately clear what was next for the former vice president. Before becoming Trump's vice president, Pence was governor of Indiana. He was first elected to the House in 2000, after 2 previous unsuccessful bids and a stretch as a talk radio host. "I am leaving this campaign, but let me promise you, I will never leave the fight for conservative values, and I will never stop fighting to elect principled Republican leaders to every office in the land. So help me God." Merrill Cornfield and Hannah Knowles contributed to this report. Hostage families say Israel operation in Gaza could endanger loved ones. Tel Aviv, Ayelet Samarano, whose 21-year-old son Jonathan was abducted by Hamas on October 7, watched on television Friday night as Israel's ground and aerial attacks on Gaza ramped up. The expanded military operation with ground troops caught her by surprise. Israeli officials had not warned the families of more than 200 hostages held by Hamas, the Palestinian militant group that controls Gaza, that the military was intensifying its siege, despite concerns that the captives could be imperiled by the government's offensive. Samarano weighed 2 deep urges, one for her son's release and the other for the decimation of the group that kidnapped him as he fled a music festival in southern Israel. "I'm not afraid of what my government does in Gaza," she said. "I'm afraid of what Hamas can do to Israel." Samarano told herself that her son would be safe during the Israeli offensive, that Hamas, she believed, was keeping the hostages underground to protect them. For Hamas, she said, the hostages are power. But not all of the families of the hostages, who span Israel's political spectrum, were as certain that their relatives would be protected in an Israeli ground invasion or a widening bombing campaign. Israeli military spokesman Rear Admiral Daniel Hagari said Friday that the confirmed number of hostages was 229. "Maybe they kept them alive until now," said Imbal Zak, 38, the cousin of Tal Shoam, who was taken hostage with his wife and 2 children, 3 and 8, after Hamas militants attacked the Be'eri kibbutz. Zak now worries that Hamas's calculations on the captives could change because of the Israeli ground operations, and perhaps they did something to them. Shoam's family, like the others, had been assigned a government representative who checks in periodically. But those meetings almost never yielded any answers to the family's questions about the government's plans to free the captives. So far, Hamas has released 4 hostages. And now there was a new question: how would the Israeli government keep the hostages safe as it conducted its most aggressive bombing campaign of Gaza in more than a decade? Yonatan Shamriz, whose brother alone was kidnapped from the Kfar Aza kibbutz, said he had stopped believing on October 7 in the possibility that Israel could coexist with Hamas-led Gaza. He found himself craving a military response. But the timing was important, he said. A military operation on the ground should begin only after the hostages are released. Then Gaza should be leveled, he said. More than 1,400 people were killed in the October 7 attacks, according to the Israeli government. Gaza's Ministry of Health said Saturday that more than 7,700 people have been killed during Israel's military response. It's a campaign that has laid waste to entire neighborhoods, displaced more than 1 million people, cut off Gaza from internet and cell phone networks, and pushed the territory's healthcare system to the brink of collapse. The families of Israeli hostages have formed a group called the Hostages and Missing Families Forum. They communicate constantly on a WhatsApp group, which was active throughout Friday night's military operation in Gaza. The families debated the risks of a ground invasion as it intensified. "We have about 200 different opinions," said Danny Elgarat, 63, whose brother Itzik was abducted from the Nir Oz kibbutz. The group released a statement on Saturday expressing concern about the impact of the military operation on the hostages. "This night was the most terrible of all nights. It was a long and sleepless night, against the backdrop of a major IDF operation in the Strip, and absolute uncertainty regarding the fate of the hostages held there, who were also subject to the heavy bombings," the statement said, referring to the Israel Defense Forces, or IDF. On Saturday, more than a dozen families of hostages gathered in central Tel Aviv and demanded a meeting with Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and Defense Minister Yoav Gallant. Some family members held signs that read POW exchange now and at any cost. Elgarat held a sign with photos of his brother and the message, "Bring him home now." Yet he believed strongly in an assertive military response in Gaza. Watching the news of the operation on Friday night, he said, "I was satisfied. If we don't defeat Hamas, Israel will be defeated," he said. Later on Saturday, the group of hostage families issued another statement, plans to remain at the gate of a government building in Tel Aviv until Netanyahu and Gallant agreed to meet with them. A few hours later, a few of the families met with Netanyahu. "We came with an unequivocal demand that military action takes into account the fate of the hostages and missing, and that any move considered will take into account the well-being of our loved ones," Meirav Leshem Gonen, mother of hostage Romi Gonen, told a crowd in Tel Aviv. Netanyahu released a video saying that securing the hostages' release was an integral component of the military campaign. "The key is the level of pressure," he said. "The greater the pressure, the greater the chances of freeing the captives."